35 years ago, I guess, at University of Virginia, and called Film and Fiction. And this was just around the Iranian Revolution, time of Iranian Revolution, the hostage crisis and all that, 33 years ago, I guess. Somehow I thought adding movies to my course would bring people to the classes. At the same time, by the way, another trick that I used to bring students who are hearing hostage crisis on television every night with Nightline and what have you. At that time, it wasn't called Nightline, it was called something else. Was I did a course on Persian cuisine. And these two sort of have a history together. Naturally, I've been thinking about the topic for quite a while, and I've been teaching this course, variations of it, ever since. And finally, a few years ago, I decided this needs to be a book. And I didn't know what to do with a book. I'm not I've been teaching cinema for 3-4 decades. I'm not a cinema expert. And that's the way you do it, you know. You shouldn't be an expert to teach it, right? But by teaching it, I've learned things about it. But my side of the story is literature, and especially fiction. And so I'm going to read part of this and talk to you a little bit, and maybe we can explore a little more in the discussions and questions and answers, if my breath allows me to continue. The world of storytelling changed somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. To put it more succinctly, our perception of how to write and even how to read stories changed. This change was certainly revolutionary, but it did not happen suddenly and instantaneously. It was an evolutionary change. Imagine living in the 19th century or 18th century before the advent of cinema and the introduction of movies into our lives. What was it like to be a reader? What was it like to be a writer? How were stories told, listened to, and written? The answer to these questions are actually not too difficult. Generally speaking, stories were created in the imagination of a writer and told in a linear or chronological fashion. In other words, the events that were envisioned as occurring first were presented first, and they were followed in the same order by other events, more or less in a chronological order. This order was also what the listener expected or reader expected. With the advent of the motion pictures, and once the potential for storytelling of this new medium was understood and took a while, essentially and naturally the filmmaker's attention was focused for the most part on the works of fiction, or the works of fiction writers, really. And of course, playwrights, we shouldn't leave them out. And another one, prose storytelling, yeah. And many novels and short stories were adapted to films. With few exceptions, it would be no exaggeration to say that in the early years, cinema was dependent on the printed words of the literary artists. Early Iranian filmmakers, perhaps emulating their Western counterparts, which has happened in Hollywood and also in Europe, were no exception to this rule. In other words, first, early filmmakers tried to turn stories which are used to into movies. In Iran, for instance, I give you a few names. One name that is always mentioned, Abu Hussein Sepanta, was a pioneer, and his effort initially started with doing things like stories from the Shahnameh, Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, and then he did an adaptation of Shirin and Farhad from Nizami. Absolutely, now he is trying to, he thinks he understands this new medium, and where is he going to get the stories? He goes to the classics, of course, right? That was a normal thing to do. The adaptation of literary works was not only an inevitable practice, but was also deemed to be desirable and was advocated. Even as late as 1949, according to one film critic in Iran, the cinema correspondent of Kayhan newspaper at the time, one of the two major newspapers, he said, "A film must be the adaptation of a great book by a famous writer." So this was the edict, right? That's what it should be. If you want to make a film, go, take Shakespeare and make a movie, right? That's it. In other words, this was his criterion, and he stated this was the criterion. The first thing to see whether the film is good or bad, right? So if it's from a good work, it can be good. Now, if you do it right, it will be really good. But if it's from the bad work, it's not from classical, don't do it. In the same way, there's another movie maker around 1951 by the name of Parviz Khatibi. He made a film called Pariche, and it was based on a popular novel at the time by Muhammad Hijazi. The novel was published in 1929, and by the same name, by the way. And it was regarded at the time, the novel was regarded as a great masterpiece. And of course, the film was made based on that. Of course, today when we look at that novel, we don't think it's a great masterpiece. It's a pretty weak novel, even as far as storylines are concerned, but it was innovative, I suppose. To get to the real story, in the second half of the 20th century, and in particular, beginning in the 1960s, when some Iranian filmmakers started to look at cinema not merely as a commercial craft, but as an art form, albeit similar to modern Persian literature, an art form at the service of social and political criticism. And I should have given a background here, but forgo that, leave that for questions and answers. A larger number of films were made by a number of filmmakers, talented directors, which were adaptations of literary works. I give you a few known titles. Dawood Mullapur did an adaptation of a very popular novel, which I have trashed in almost everything I have written in the past 40 years. And maybe I trashed it because it was, it is called Ahu Khanum's Husband. And it was a thick novel. It came out in the early 1950s, and it won the Royal Prize somehow, from the Royal Court. And it is supposedly a novel in support of women's rights, but it is pretty lame as far as I'm concerned. I've tried to reread it and find some redeeming quality in it, and it's very hard to find it. Anyway, I heard a couple of weeks ago somebody sent me an email, wanted to translate it. I said, why? You know, then, but in the 1960s, late 1960s, then you have a movie by Darush Mehjoui, extremely talented, probably one of the top 2 or 3 best directors Iran has produced. The famous movie, The Cow, right? The Cow was based on a segment of Ghulam Hussein Saadi's sort of novel collection of short stories, episodes, or whatever it is. So again, another example is, by the way, the novel, and it's hard to call it novel exactly because Saadi did weird things. Azadarane Bial, the Mourners of Bial, that was one episode. The Cow was based on one episode of that. This collaboration, by the way, between, this is interesting, the collaboration between Saadi, who was, when he was alive, possibly the most popular playwright Iran ever produced at the time anyway, and most prolific, no question about it, and socially conscious. At least one could say one of the 2 major playwrights Iran has produced. The other one, fortunately, is alive and is now in California, out of the claws of the mullahs. With Bahram Bezai, and I'll come to him too later. But this collaboration between the filmmaker Mehjoui and Saadi went on for several other things too. One of them was the cycle. It was translated into English. The cycle, which in Persian was the Daire Mina, which is the circle of Mina, or something else. The cycle came out around the time of revolution, just before the revolution, and it was based on a short story in Persian called Ashqalduni, which is a trash heap. Now we're talking about not at this point. This is not just popular cinema. This is becoming serious, socially conscious, committed cinema, which is sort of writers, committed writers, engagé writers are joining hands with filmmakers. And this is the adaptations, this is how it's going on. Give you then there were other attempts also. Naturally, the most famous writer of 20th century Iran ever, in 20th century, possibly even today, one would say Sadegh Hidayat. He would be the attractive, right? And a very popular filmmaker and also very talented, but he is still alive, and he is the guy who sort of tries to make a balance between popular cinema and serious cinema. Parviz Kimyai, and Parviz Kimyai is the husband of some of the Iranians know around here. He was the husband of Gugush, the most famous writer, singer, right? All right. So this is he's got a very serious side to him, and then so he adapted a short story by Hidayat Dashakol, and it's actually one of the better movies in 20th century movies. Amir Naderi, another talented filmmaker who's now making films in New York, and absolutely a natural filmmaker. He made an adaptation of Sadegh Chubak's Tangsir, a sort of a rebel against the monarchy. Of course, the setting is late 19th century, early 20th century, but it became a very popular movie, again, as a committed, engagé type of a work. There are many other examples, but I give you one very important one. Prince Ehtejab, which appeared in late 1960s, a really experimental novel in terms of technique, in terms of narrative, in terms of characters, in terms of everything. And it was immediately adapted pretty soon, like a couple of years later, adapted by American educated filmmaker Bahman Farmanara. Very good film, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in this. There were naturally somebody is going to ask, what is the first most famous novel, 20th century novel still? The only one which has been selling since in the English translation has been selling since 1958 for 5 different dates, 1950s anyway. And that's The Blind Owl. 3 films have been made of that. All of them are bad. It's not, none of them are really worth watching. I used 2 of them in my classes, but students who have read the story get bored and they leave. They don't want. They said, "I wish you had not shown me that movie," and they were right. They are right, usually. I shift gear and say, at first glance, this list indicates the list. I read some of it for you. A continuation of the dependence of at least some of the notable filmmakers on the work of literary artists. This dependence on it. But while this may be true, this dependence of cinema on literature is no longer one-sided. Rather, in the course of a few decades, it has developed into interdependence. Earlier filmmakers' adaptations were actually based on traditional narratives, classics, right? Which were by and large linear. And the filmmakers would try to turn the words into pictures in a linear form, often facing difficult challenges and ending up altering the work to make it suitable for visual presentation, and usually failing to fully capture the entire story, which is natural, right? The popular saying, read the book, don't wait for the movie, and the usual comments of readers whose expectations are not met by the film adaptations of their favorite novels indicate the perceived failure of filmmakers. In other words, the filmmaker is trying to change one medium into another, and that's the first step towards failure. That's why they failed mostly, and most of us read the book and said, the movie, don't see the movie, read the book, right? The task of many later filmmakers, however, was different. Since the literary works they adapted had themselves undergone certain inevitable changes as a result of the ever-increasing influence of cinema on the psyche of the 20th century man and woman, of course, including fiction writers. So this is the shift that is changing place. Gradually, as we move towards the second half of the 20th century, I, as a writer, I cannot write the story that I wrote 50 years earlier anymore, because now I have had quite a bit of exposure by the middle century to cinema, and I cannot write a story like a 19th century writer anymore. What is called the experimental nature of modern Persian fiction, which has been generally described as experimentation in form and presentation, is in fact experimentation in narrative devices, structure, and strategies which brought about changes in the written art of storytelling. Speaking in general terms about late 20th century Persian fiction, in contrast to the works of earlier writers such as Muhammad Ali Jamalzadeh, one of the first modern writer, or Sadiq Hidayat, Buzurg Alavi, Mahmoud Behazin, and others, the early writers. Well-known writer and critic Jamal Mir Sadiqi says that the recent novels and short stories have become more, and the word he uses, Arabic-based, tasviri, pictorial, right? He says that later novels become pictorial. So it's not, the word's not doing it. So the writer is after showing you pictures, and this is already, he sees that. In other words, in contrast to the often character-based or event-based earlier stories, which in some way, in some respect, mostly tell about the character's personality traits, such as most of Jamalzadeh's work, or the internal workings of characters' minds, such as Hidayat's stories, including The Blind Owl. More recent novelists and short story writers attempt to show the characters through their behavior and action. Okay? This is the shift which happens. And of course, there's the famous book here, right? The good novelists in 20th century are supposed to show, not to tell, right? This was already the shift, and we weren't thinking about it. Indeed, if we consider the major difference between the written form and the visual form of stories, that is, fiction and cinema, it is clear that traditionally fiction writers had to generally rely on telling their stories, whereas filmmakers inevitably have to show their stories. That's inevitable, right? You have a cinema, right? And this can arguably be considered one of the main differences between fictional narrative and cinematic narrative. Earlier filmmakers' attempts at adapting novels and short stories were doomed from the onset, especially if they tried to follow the written narrative techniques that were used for telling a story. This is also partly true of telling the reader about an event rather than showing it. But on the whole, given the visual nature of the medium of cinema, filmmakers are more successful in the reproduction of scenes and events in their adaptations of written stories that are in the less visual aspects of a written narrative, such as a character's thought processes, right? Mir Sadiqi's observations, the critic's observations about recent Persian fiction becoming pictorial or visual, however, merely touches the surface of the changes that have occurred in fiction writing. Modern fiction writers, of course, reach back to earlier, even traditional narrative models, genres, subject matters, and so on, to create their own work. But we should remember that for many authors today, movies and other forms of visual storytelling that they watch, either in theaters or on television, make up at least as much of their exposure to stories and plots as do written works. In other words, we probably get most of our stories visually today. How much do we read? We read, even if you're, an avid reader reading every day, you might read one novel, right? At night, you sit down in front of television and watch 5 novels, at least 5 short stories, right? And this is true about the writers too. Moreover, the books they read, the books that the writers read, often are written by other contemporary authors who are influenced by film and television, thereby perpetuating the narrative techniques borrowed from the audiovisual media. Modern authors make use of, consciously or subconsciously, such cinematic practices as shots, cutting, lighting, depth of picture, and so forth in their descriptive narratives of scenes. Nasser Taqvai, for instance, begins his short stories. I'll tell you about it a little bit later why I choose him. He has a short story called Agha Julu, which translates as Mr. Julio. It's Mr. Julio, but you know. He starts the short story with this, and I'm going to read you this opening and to make a point. This is Taqvai's short story. The sea, that's right at the beginning, right? The sea, which is neither blue nor green, has pushed the town back, halfway up the mountain. At high tide, the waves' white froth sinks in the sand at the threshold of the first houses. The waves beat against the dikes between the stone wall and the circles, stone wall that circles the lowland and the dock. Behind the wall, built along the dock, are a few shops and a shellfish cleaning factory, and the shades cast by the wall is the porter's hangout. The opening paragraph of the story begins with a panoramic view, the sea which is neither blue nor green, right? Panoramic view or a long shot showing the sea, the town, the mountain. The point of view is that of a camera that is located some distance from the shore in the sea, capturing the waves. Capturing the waves, the sand, the houses, the dike, and so on. In the next paragraph, the camera moves to a different spot, and we see this, and I'm quoting. Dark, patternless brown mountains hump behind the town, curl around the bare, sandy hill, and disappear into the sea, except for a few scattered rocks jutting out of the water here and there. The beacon blinks a bit farther away in the sea. At night, the moon shines into the room through the open window. On the water, the beacon fuses its red beams with the moonlight each time it flashes. The next picture of the same view is of the same view, but this time just before sunrise. So as in a movie, all of a sudden you see it's a night vision of some place, you're seeing it, and then about 10 seconds later, the sun's come up and you see the same scene, right? This is doing exactly the same thing. The same scene. At dawn, when the moon grows pale on the mountains, the long distant line between the sea and the sky casts a white gleam. You can hear the fishermen's voices and the sound of their oars as their boats approach the horizon, black against the silvery glitter of the water. Now, as the sun rises, the camera turns toward the town, and now it is just before sunset. When the white line in the horizon turns yellow, and the sun reaches, and this is the story, and the sun reaches the high ventilation towers of the houses and the dome-like covers of the tanks, the fishermen return. The sun looks from above. The camera this time begins to zoom in, and we see a closer shot of the beach and the inhabitants of the town. On the sandy beach, old men shade their eyes. It's close now, we can see it. Old men shade their eyes from the sun, watching the boats anxiously. Once fishermen, they now weave fishing nets and wait for the boats, hoping to make a few pennies by repairing the nets torn by sharks. The women wear loose gowns and with embroidered skirts. They watch the boats through the two holes of their black veils, anxious to get the fish in time for their husbands' meals. Naked children stand beside a mound of colorful loincloths, ready to jump into the water when the boats get near. Farther away, the porter sits in the shade, leaning against the wall, waiting for a boat or a ship, if it has been a few months since the last one's arrival. In the last paragraph of the opening section of the story, the camera is located somewhere inside the town, showing us medium and close shots of various structures and scenes, ending with a shot of a broken window. From the tops of the ventilation towers, the sun penetrates the rooms through the colored glass windows, painting rainbows on the plaster walls. The large house facing the children's playground never catches the sun in its windows. The townspeople have broken the glass with stones. All right? This I just, with a few explanations I read at the beginning. It is already, the writer who is doing this is already visualizing, but it is not the same type of visualization that Dickens did. It's a visualization which has been influenced by cinema and by the visual arts that we've seen 20th century. Interestingly now, Nasser Taqwai eventually gave up short story writing, and he became one of Iran's major directors. I suppose that has something to do with it. But you can really go through, and in the work I'm doing, in the book I'm writing, I do that. I go through different writers, and toward the end of 20th century especially. As you move to the later decades, this becomes more pronounced in the works of even unsuspecting writers like Mahmoud Dolatabadi, Sadiq Chubak. They are much more visual. And then you come to the later ones like Ghazal Alizadeh and Monir Ravanipour. It becomes almost pure cinema. And they, whether they are doing it consciously or subconsciously, my beef is that they are doing it subconsciously. Sometimes they are conscious. I mean, once in a while you get a writer, and I hear this. If this work gets translated, is Hollywood going to be interested? And there are writers who write like this, but for the most part, they are not. It is subconscious influence. I want to, let me see, I'm talking too much, and I want to just take another, I don't want to read you all of these things. Another aspect of this influence of cinema, I talked about the visual, but I read you a paragraph, and if I have time, I will give you a couple of examples. Another perhaps more important influence of the audiovisual media in general, and cinema in particular, on the work of modern fiction writers is the non-linear, fragmented mode of presentation, which has become a distinguishing feature of modern fiction. Fragmented, non-linear stories are often cause tremendous confusion and frustration for casual readers, those who generally read as pastime, and often result in the book being tossed aside and accusations being made against the writer of having produced an incoherent work. Right? We've seen a lot of that. Many such readers, by way of contrast, have no problem following and understanding the same kind of non-linear, fragmented sequence of events when they watch films. Right? You go to a movie, the scene changes, and you immediately know, okay, of course, This is back in the farm, right? This is easy. When you see that narrative technique in a written form, say, what the heck's going on here? What happened? You know, this is what is it. In other words, let me give you the reason. Of course, is that over the course of many years they have become visually accustomed to and learned how to follow cinematic narrative structures and techniques, such as flashback and so forth, right? Which are utilized without any warning in films, while written fiction that uses the same techniques appears enigmatic and confusing to them, right? This type of modern fiction is what Roland Barthes calls writerly, right? As opposed to readerly texts, right? While readerly texts essentially are the production of the storytellers and are generally entertaining and serve to fill the leisure time of the reader, writerly texts require partnership and participation by the reader in the process of production of meaning. This participation partly involves decoding, as it were, the fragmented, non-linear narrative, but of course it is more, since it also enhances the story semantically and adds to the multiple layers of meaning. Right? So just keep this in mind. The example I want to read, I'll talk about it rather than read it for you. The novel I mentioned before, Prince Ehtejab, one of the most important and possibly popular novels in a way, Persian novels in 20th century. When it came out, as it was the case with most, the work of most serious writers, it was read only by university students, very small audiences, possibly the best books, sold about 2,000 copies. And of course, university students and intellectuals and so forth, they always waited to see what comes out, and they want, this is for the cause, fighting the regime and so forth and all that, right? When this book came out, even a lot of students who were used to rather abstract poetry of, 20th century Persian poetry is pretty abstract, and the reason for abstraction, I can say a lot of things about it, is partly censorship maybe, but other things too. They were all confused. Golshiri was accused of not knowing the principles of narrative at all. That he didn't know how to write, in other words. About, as I said, a couple of years later, Bahman Farmanara, filmmaker, he took this film and screened it. I mean, he took this story and filmed it. And nobody had any problems with that. And basically, this is one of the closest adaptations of a Persian story that I know. Now, what source of confusion I give you? In Prince Ehtejab, there is early 20th century. You have during possibly the time of Reza Shah in the 20s or 30s. You have a prince who is left over from the Qajar dynasty from 19th century, and he, of course, now the dynasty has been defeated, and now he's basically gambled away all the money of the family. He doesn't have anything else, and he's got a wife, also a princess, but a very sharp and intelligent, by the very mouthful name of Fakhrun Nisa, the pride of women. That's her name, right? And they have the same ancestors, of course, and she comes and sits and says, Prince, yes, I want to read you something about our ancestors. And then he starts reading about the ancestors, and yes, the ancestors are these cruel kings, each one of them, they killed hundreds of people, and this is the way you were a king, right? And the other thing, the two things made them distinct from everything else, right? One was how cruel they were. Number two, how many women they had, right? The two things. And so this poor prince in the 20th century now, left over from 19th century, is sitting over there. And this, the pride of women, his wife, is poking, Well, how many women have you had? How many? And he's trying to think. He thinks the most cruel thing he did when he was a kid, he climbed the ladder and he went up, and there was a nest there, and a nest of sparrows. He took a baby sparrow and pulled the eyes out. This is the most cruel thing he's done, as opposed to his ancestors who each, just would walk around and kill people, this. And as far, now the second part of it that I want to go on for the women. In his harem, this is his wife who's dominating him, right? He's got a mate who's the daughter of a gardener. And her name is Fakhri. This is related, the name Fakhri, right? Fakhrun. And there's a confusion. The confusion is that part of the story is when both the wife and the maid are there. That is so once in a while the prince, in order to show that I'm still the prince, pinches the girl, the maid. But the wife knows it, makes fun of him, says, is that all you can do? Is that it? That's it? Now, as we go through the story, there are other things involved in this. The wife disappears because she dies. She has they have the ancestral consumption. Everybody is tuberculosis, right? Everybody. So that wife dies, and now the prince is left with the maid. The only thing is the prince has decided that I'm going to not only control her, but I'm controlling my wife. And he orders her to dress up like the wife, and she has to dress up like the wife. So first, let's give you a scene. The scene is Fakhri, the maid, is in the kitchen, and she has to cook and so forth, and put the dinner on the table, and then she has to change and put the princess's clothes on and sit down across the prince and have dinner, right? Now this is, I'm really simplifying the narrative for you. It's not that simple. What happens is we don't have here, parts of the story are first person narrative from the prince's point of view. Parts of the story are first-person narratives through the maid's point of view. Parts of the story are a third-person narration, which could be either or none of them. And these, overlapping of narrative, and of course the other techniques that cinematic techniques. The flashback is nothing. You're sitting. The prince in one scene, the early scenes, sitting in a living room type of thing with the photographs of the ancestors, and the ancestors, all of a sudden, the great-grandfather, the great king, jumps out of the picture and starts talking to him. Now, if you're reading this story, so what happened? Is the picture talking? When you see it in the theater, well, that's ordinary, right? We see in all sorts of movies, right? The picture becomes alive when you come to talk. Nothing. What my interest in this particular work I'm doing is to get to, my interest, as I said, is fiction, really. Cinema is going its own way. What's going to happen to fiction? What's going to happen to fiction writing? Are all fiction writers going to become screenwriters? Or is fiction going to continue? Are we going to be readers the way we have been for a few centuries, really, not many centuries, you know. Reading was an exclusive activity up to 4 or 5 centuries ago. But are we going to be the readers that we were before in the past few centuries? And what kind of writers are we going to have? If it becomes so cumbersome that I cannot understand, because maybe because the method of narration is in the wrong medium. It's cinema narration, and I'm thinking about that's creative narration here, but it isn't. It is killing the readership, right? It is killing the readership. What I want to see, what I want to figure out is what's going to happen, what is happening to the future of experimental fiction. I'm not talking about, I mean, the future of dime novels is secure. Don't you ever worry about that. That's going to be there. All of us are suckers for dime novels, and we're going to read them forever. No problem. But future of experimental fiction, which is really where this art is going to go, right? Is it going to be consumed completely by the medium of cinema? It seems like it is being consumed. And are the fiction writers coming up with new ways, in the same way that the filmmakers fought really and gained their independence from the fiction writers? Are the fiction writers also going to gain their independence from the filmmakers? This is, I don't know, in Hollywood, I can't really look at Hollywood and think of it that way, because Hollywood's a different animal completely. I look at cinemas, for instance, first of all, and fiction that are more interested in the art form rather than in the money. Iranian cinema, at least in the past 4 decades maybe, has been a director's cinema, and not only a director's cinema, gradually it's become an auteur cinema. It's, filmmakers, they write with their cameras. They don't need a story. Nader happens to be a friend. He comes once in a while. When I look at him, I see that he has found absolute independence from writing. He talks cinema. He eats cinema. He drinks cinema. He calls me once in a while from New York, and he calls me at 5 o'clock, exactly. He says, "Mo," I say, "Yeah, where is your drink?" So I have to go get a glass, put ice in it. I have to pour the scotch in the glass by the foam. He has to hear the scotch melting the ice in the glass. He doesn't drink, by the way. All right? He doesn't drink. This is the sound, okay? It is, I do. It is that he, you know, you walk with him, you sit and talk to him, every word is cut. You know, he wants to say, okay, this is the end of my sentence here, it's a cut. And his filmmaking, he came about 4 or 5 years ago to Austin, and he says, oh, I have this thing, but I want to make this movie, and I want somebody to write the script. I said, what's the movie about? Of course, he's been making the same movie over and over again, right? I know what the story is. And he said, oh, this is this little town. I want to find a town in West Texas. This little town, and I want it to be a sort of abandoned town, and I wanted this, and it tells me the story of the little boy. This is his story, of course, always. And I said, well, who's going to write this story? He said, well, I don't really want to write. Somebody sit down, talk to me. Do you have somebody in the film department that can sit down and talk to me about this script? And after a couple of days, he decides, no, I've talked to you about it enough. Don't tell anybody, by the way. And then he borrows a friend of ours, sits in the car, and they start driving towards California to look for the town. He already knows where it is. He has nothing to do with writing, even though somebody has told him you have to have a script. He doesn't need it anymore. This is the purest, he's pure cinema. I look at him pure cinema. Now, and this is when I see absolute independence. And this is the guy who began his career as he made Tangsir based on a novel. He's complete. And he's, by the way, he doesn't even have a high school education, by the way. One of the best filmmakers in the world, right? He doesn't have a high school education. He's completely gained his independence. And what's going to happen to fiction? I'm worried more about it. I want to see what some of the new writers are doing. The more I'm reading the modern, more younger authors, and yesterday we were talking about Shahryar Mandanipur, I don't know. It is still cinema, right? It is. And this is my talk. Thank you. Now,